Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. In this episode, we delve into the intriguing, and dare I say, the nearly Shakespearean saga of Central Asia's navigation through the tempestuous seas of international politics. Amidst Russia's war on Ukraine and the recent attack on the Crocus City Hall, a tale of pragmatism emerges. The relations between Russia and Central Asian countries remind us of a dizzying ballet of diplomacy that would make even Tchaikovsky take notes. Take a look at our latest report at how last week's attack influenced the Asian minorities living in Russia.
Following a deadly terrorist attack outside Moscow, which had since been attributed to 4 Tajik nationals, Central Asian migrants in Russia have faced increased backlash. The incident has led to heightened security measures, including workplace raids and detentions, particularly targeting migrants. The embassy of Tajikistan has advised its citizens to stay indoors, and there are reports of migrants experiencing racism and violence. Nearly 4 million Central Asian migrants are estimated to live in Russia, mainly filling essential roles in the economy. However, this population often faces marginalization and anti-immigration sentiment, which has reportedly worsened since the attack. Russian President Vladimir Putin has labeled the attackers as radical Islamists, but has not specifically targeted the Tajik community, instead suggesting links to Ukraine and its Western allies. The situation of the migrants community worsens as Russian authorities disregard legalities in their investigation. Human rights activists, including those supporting migrant laborers who could align themselves with Tajik migrants, have fled Russia following the invasion of Ukraine.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. In the grand geopolitical theater, Central Asia has opted for a role that is less about siding with the protagonist or antagonist and more about playing the room, maximally pragmatic, as they say. This is a region where economic and political interests are as intertwined as vines in an ancient forest. Central Asian states are masters at the art of survival, dancing between the raindrops of international pressure and opportunity. Imagine, if you will, a warlord turned lawmaker calling for the annexation of Central Asian countries to teach them Russians in their own backyards. The audacity, right? But here's the twist. The statements, rather than sparking outrage, are met with a mix of dismissal and strategic silence. Central Asia, it seems, is not in the game of making enemies. The region is resource-rich, strategically located, and astutely aware of its value in the geopolitical marketplace. With Russia facing sanctions and looking to keep its influence, Central Asia is playing a master-level game of diplomatic finesse, keeping Moscow close, but also opening its arms to investments and treaties from China, the United States, and beyond. In this grand chess game, Central Asia's moves are calculated to ensure economic gains without political entanglement. They engage in a multi-vector policy that's as pragmatic as it gets, exploiting the war's economic opportunities while carefully avoiding any moves that could lead to direct confrontation with global powers. Now, a word about the exports and migrants. Despite not recognizing Moscow's annexations, Central Asia's trade with Russia, especially in dual-use goods, has thrived. The West sanctions? Merely a fly to be swatted away. Despite the looming shadow of war, labor migrants keep flowing to Russia. Their earnings sent back as remittance serve as a vital lifeline for their families at home. In this story, Russia's influence is undeniable. Its cultural and political gravity, a fact of life. Yet the narrative isn't one of subservience, but of nuanced navigation through the murky waters of international relations. Central Asia's relationship with Russia is complex, layered, and above all, pragmatic. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Bruce Pannier from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So when we talk about Central Asia, many people compare it to a very complex geopolitical chess game. Can you first let us know what are the pieces and kind of set the stage for us?
Well, of course, if you look at its location on the map, you can see that it also borders China, Afghanistan, Iran, the Caspian Sea. So there's a lot of neighbors that have influence on what Central Asia is doing and how their politics are shaped. Russia is just one of several. Now, Russia obviously has the most recent historical links to Central Asia, but all the countries around Central Asia have links that go far back. And on many levels, as you pointed out. I mean, there are some countries that are looking to Central Asia as a supplier of resources. China, I'll name. There are some countries that are looking to Central Asia as a transit area to get goods between them and another country that neighbors Central Asia. And there's others that have ancient historical roots too. Again, China would be one of them, but Iran, the Middle East, Afghanistan. I mean, the ties go back thousands of years. There's all kinds of different considerations going on here about how Central Asia views its international relations, and that shapes its relations with Russia also.
Right, and with all these factors coming in and interest from all different factions, how are they able to kind of juggle all these international relationships?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's a very fragile balance that they've struck in cases, and it varies from country to country, right? If you're Kazakhstan, then you have a 7,800 kilometer long border with Russia, and then you also have a 1,500 kilometer long border with China. These are primary players in how you shape your policy, and also in trade too. So this is one of the things that they have to take into consideration. They have security concerns. Afghanistan has always been a worry for them since they became independent in 1991. Russia, having had military bases and knowing the terrain in Central Asia and also in Afghanistan because of the Soviet occupation, is a key player for them and a guarantor to some degree of security in the region. Obviously, how much security Russia can provide is now in question after their full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which hasn't really gone so well, certainly not as well as the Kremlin had hoped. And then, like I said, there's exports and imports that they have to consider. A lot of these countries, Kazakhstan has a great deal of oil. Turkmenistan has the fourth largest reserves of natural gas. They would like to get that out to customers east, west, north, and south if they possibly can. And again, I had mentioned transit routes. With Russia being complicated now to ship goods through, China and Europe are really stepping up to make Central Asia the so-called middle corridor, right? This is the new trade route that they're trying to open up based on the ancient Silk Route, but now, by rail, road, ship, across the Caspian Sea, and even plane in some cases too. So there's a lot of things going on right now in Central Asia.
All right, and I would like to hone in on the Russian aspect because, as we do know, Russia has a way of strong arming their international relations when it comes to their neighbors. And all these Central Asian countries neighboring Russia, somehow they were able to strike that balance and not being strong armed into making some of the decisions that Russia really wants to see. How was that achieved?
Well, obviously, post 9/11, the U.S. and its allies used some bases in Central Asia. They were also depending on Central Asia as a transit route to get goods between Europe and Afghanistan. That helped to detach Central Asia somewhat from Russia, not to mention the foreign investment that came along with the presence of Western countries in the region. China has grown, amazingly in terms of its economic power, and since it's right next door to Central Asia, it has also become very, very influential in the region now. I was there in the early 1990s. You couldn't find anything, any Chinese person, any Chinese company, anything out there. Now it's quite the opposite, where Chinese influence is everywhere. You can't go practically to any of the countries without seeing Chinese companies operating and Chinese workers out there also. So this also helps to detach Central Asia somewhat from Russia and give them some guarantees too of sovereignty. Since China is also obviously a huge player, it borders Central Asia, and it gives them a balance with Russia. When Russia threatens them, they can turn to China and get assurances that they won't be invaded by Russia, that they won't be taken over, which is in China's interest, of course. As I mentioned, China views Central Asia as a resource base. They've invested billions and billions of dollars into Central Asia to develop oil fields, gas fields, uranium sites. They don't want to see that all go up in smoke, so to speak, if Russia decides that they're going to try to reclaim this territory. So it has helped Central Asia to be more independent, but at the same time, of course, it's a very, very very interesting balancing act that they have to strike. They do want good ties with the West. They do want good ties with the Middle East now. They do want good ties with the old colonial master Russia, and they do want good ties with China, but they don't want to be too much under the influence of any of those regions or countries.
And do you think the recent attack on the Crocus Hall near Moscow, with the involvement of people from that region, might change the perspective and calculation of how things are carried out?
The images, the pictures of these four, they're actually Tajik nationals, that they've arrested. I mean, they brought them into the courtroom to be arraigned, and they were obviously had been beaten badly. I mean, the one guy had to be brought in a wheelchair. When you're in Central Asia and you see these images, it reminds you of how Russians tend to view Central Asia as something of second-class citizens, second-class nations, really. And that it's fair game to put some of their own nationals on television, and clearly after torture. And it really hits home for Central Asia because Russia has been a source of income for many people in Central Asia. Let's not forget that there's at least 8 million Central Asian laborers in Russia right now. So, there's no work at home. They're happy that they can go to Russia because the visa restrictions are very loose. If there are any visa restrictions at all, if they can kind of speak the language. Some still remember it. Some have learned it easily because it's still everywhere in Central Asia. So the remittances that they're able to send back are very important to the families back in Central Asia. They account for huge amounts of the GDP in some of these countries. It's almost half the GDP in Tajikistan comes from remittances that come out of Russia. Kyrgyzstan is not far behind. Uzbekistan could be anywhere 15% of their GDP comes from these remittances. So they really do need Russia as a partner. And Russia needs these people to work too. I mean, they're construction workers, street sweepers, taxi drivers. There's no other labor pool that they can turn to fill these kind of jobs. They certainly can't do it domestically with their own people. So it's really important for both sides to keep as amiable a relationship as possible because they're both benefiting from the way things have been prior to the attack March 22nd in Moscow.
Right, and when it comes to geopolitical situation, can you also tell us how the U.S. kind of factor into this whole equation?
Well, I'd mentioned post 9/11, the U.S. had a pretty big presence in there. It was the first time that the U.S. really had a significant interest in Central Asia, historically. So it was something for the Central Asians. There was, interestingly, some movement toward democratic reforms and strengthening democratic institutions right after the U.S. showed up and started to use some of those infrastructure facilities in Central Asia for its operations in Afghanistan. America, the image of America, of course, is also something to take into account, too. I mean, everyone recognizes a superpower, both economically and militarily. It was shown in Afghanistan that they've done militarily, certainly as art. The Central Asians worried about the Taliban in the late 1990s, and it was a huge relief for them when the United States and its allies deposed the Taliban from rule and removed effectively the threat from the Central Asian Afghan border for the Central Asians. So they benefited hugely from 20 years of foreign forces being in Afghanistan. Not only the security angle, but also because so much infrastructure to connect them with Afghanistan was built at the same time. Roads, the one railway that existed when everything started at 9/11 was extended to the Afghan city of Mazar-e-Sharif. Their electricity, as I mentioned, transmission power cables now connect them and are a source of sizable income for some of the Central Asian countries. Tens of millions of dollars they get every year from shipping electricity there to Afghanistan. So, the U.S. did have a big and beneficial presence in Central Asia for a while. Now, obviously, it's disconcerting to the people in Central Asia that the abrupt U.S. pullout from Afghanistan. So there's a lot of lingering doubts about what exactly American policy is all about, that they kind of just all of a sudden cut and run, so as they say in America, without leaving any kind of viable solution in Afghanistan, and left all the neighbors, of course, to fend for themselves and try to come up with a new relationship with the Taliban once they came back to power.
Right, and of course there's so many different factors into this whole thing, and another kind of player in this area that I would like to ask you about is the involvement of Turkey and how it has its relation with Central Asia.
Well, Turkey is, of course, has always been an interesting partner for Central Asia. When I was there in the early 90s, this was the real partner of choice for Central Asia. They were really hoping that Turkey would help them and establish a much greater presence in Central Asia. Unfortunately, economically, Turkey couldn't do the things that the Central Asians wanted. Now, there are four countries in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan that are effectively Turkic nations. Their languages do not differ very much from Turkish. They're mutually intelligible. Many people from the region have gone to Turkey. It's also a destination for migrant laborers. They seem to be pretty welcome there. Lately, we've seen the reformation of a body, an organization that they'd formed years ago, which is now called the Organization of Turkic States and involves the four Central Asian states that I mentioned, Azerbaijan, which also is a Turkic country, and Turkey. So Turkey is now able to, still can't provide them with the economic help that they wish they could get, but the rise of Turkish military prowess. For example, Turkey is the leading supplier of weapons to Turkmenistan, for example. Turkey also plays a role potentially as an export transit route for energy resources. Right now, they're looking at oil pipelines, gas pipelines, even electricity that they can ship from Central Asia through Turkey and get to Europe if possible. So it's an up and coming player in the region, Turkey a resurgent, if you will, and it's something that the Central Asians are really hoping for and supporting at the same time, because this is really, it's a cultural cousin. They would rather do business with Turkey than they would with the Chinese or the Russians or the U.S. or Europe, because their historical ties and linguistic affinities to Turkey are much stronger than they are with any other place in the world.
All right. So yeah, definitely a lot to unpack here. And thanks for helping us understand a little bit more about this region. Really appreciate it. And thanks again for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on your program.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the latest stories from the East that you don't want to miss. In a recent statement, Russian President Vladimir Putin emphasized that Russia harbors no aggressive intention towards NATO countries. He labeled such claim as complete nonsense and a ploy to manipulate public opinion and allocate additional resources to supporting Ukraine.
Speaking to Air Force pilots at a facility in the Tver region northwest of Moscow, Putin dismissed the notion that Russia would attack countries like Poland, the Baltic states or the Czech Republic. However, he issued a warning asserting that if aircraft were to take off from airfields in third countries against Russia, they would become legitimate targets regardless of their location. Ukraine, anticipating the delivery of at least 42 F-16s from Western allies, has been preparing its pilots for months. Training is underway at various international bases, including Denmark, Romania and United States. The logistics of housing F-16s at Ukrainian air bases remain uncertain. These advanced aircraft require high-quality runways and well-protected hangars. As tensions escalate, the world watches closely to see how this delicate situation unfolds.
Bulgaria, a country no stranger to political upheaval, is gearing up for its sixth general election since April 2021. The latest twist in this saga comes as the populist party named There Is Such a People declined to form a government on March 28th, becoming the third party to do so.
Bulgaria, the poorest among the 27 European Union members, grapples not only with economic challenges, but also with widespread corruption. It has been no stranger to political instability, especially since major anti-corruption protests rocked the country in 2020. Before the elections last year, Bulgaria relied on caretaker governments appointed by President Radev due to the absence of the stable election coalition. Now, as consultations with potential caretaker prime minister begin, all eyes are on the next chapter in Bulgaria's tumultuous political journey. In the past 2 years, both the center-right GERB and its former coalition partner, the pro-Western Continue the Change Democratic Bulgaria, failed in their attempts to form a new cabinet. With ITN's refusal, the path is now clear for President Raman Rudev to appoint a caretaker government and set the stage for election within the next 2 months.
Reports from various human rights organizations have highlighted a surge in violence in Mali, with Russian mercenaries implicated in numerous civilian casualties. The Wagner Group, a Russian private military company, has been assisting Malian government forces in operations that have resulted in the death of many civilians, including children.
The situation in Mali has been precarious for over a decade, with jihadist insurgencies causing turmoil across the region. Following military coups, Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger have distanced themselves from French military support, opting instead for the assistance of Russian mercenaries. Since the arrival of these mercenaries following the 2021 coup, Mali has seen an increase in aggressive military actions, including drone strikes on civilian gatherings and raids that have led to civilian fatalities. The death of Wagner's leader Yevgeny Prigozhin in a plane crash last year has not diminished Russia's influence in the region. In response to the escalating violence, the ruling juntas of Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso have announced the formation of a joint security force to combat extremist threats. This move aligns with their pivot toward Russian support, diverging from the strategies favored by regional and Western allies. Despite promises from the military governments to quell the insurgencies, analysts indicate that the violence has only intensified under their rule.
The Armenian government is currently facing a complex dilemma regarding the delimitation of its border with Azerbaijan. The issue revolves around the planned transfer of jurisdiction over 4 villages which Armenia has controlled since the 1990s to Azerbaijan.
Prime Minister Nikol Pashin's administration has indicated a readiness to return the villages unilaterally, a move seen by supporters as a gesture meant to expedite a border delimitation pact with Azerbaijan. Critics, however, view it as a potential security risk, fearing it could provide Azerbaijan with an excuse for further military action. The question of the villages is strategically significant, affecting travel on a highway connecting Armenia to Georgia and the location of pipelines carrying Russian natural gas to Armenia. The proposed handover had led to a strong backlash in Armenia, particularly among residents of the Tavush region, who are concerned about increased security threats. The situation is further complicated by historical grievances, as the villages were occupied by Armenian forces during the First Karabakh War in the 1990s. With domestic tensions rising in Armenia and pro-government media in Azerbaijan applying pressure, the resolution of this border delimitation dilemma remains a critical and sensitive issue for the region.
And that's all in this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.